In this video, I'm going to try to outline what I think we're going to need to do for our next 2 sprints. I believe Ada requested that we try to come up with a plan for what we're going to do for the next couple sprints. And from my understanding, the best thing for us to do is to use a example that allows us to set up a full machine learning service and the operations with it. So that's what I'm going to try to explain today, and hopefully that's satisfying what you're expecting from us. So just a little outline of what we're going to do. I think this isn't necessarily 100% accurate and covering all the important stuff, but just a kind of set of guidelines here. But basically what I'm going to talk about in this video is all the things we're going to need to make, how we're going to do them, where we're going to do them, and anything that goes into developing an MLOps service, basically. And hopefully I cover everything at least sufficiently. This is only the stuff that I'm really familiar with at this point, so there's probably some stuff missing, but I'll do my best to explain maybe where I lack understanding and my teammates might be able to compensate for that, or, you know, an area where we just need to learn a little bit more and how we can do that. So I'll try to do both. I'm going to talk about the simplest stuff first, maybe the most obvious part of what we need to set up, which is some of the scripts we need to write. I'm not going to, these scripts listed here are just from an example from one of the videos that Databricks did on their platform and how they do MLOps. So they're just generic names, basically, just to give you an idea of what kind of things we might need to do. What I really want to talk about is the structure around the code. So first things first, basically you have to, the best way to do it, it seems, is have all your code interfaced with a Git provider, right? So you can do Databricks repositories that will integrate with any Git provider, and that's the best way to keep code structured throughout each part of the life cycle. So through development, staging, and production, is to keep different branches and have it all structured through Git. So that's really important, part of what I wanted to talk about. The other thing is there's kind of, in Databricks materials, there's a lot of focus on when to use notebooks versus scripts, and it was a little confusing to me, but it seems that there is a major significance for operations in the long run. So they were talking about the fact that notebooks are really good for interacting with machine learning and data and things like that. But when it comes to developing a service or something you're going to provide to a customer, really everything still has to be done through scripts, even though they've created this new platform that has nice new features. Everything still needs to be through scripts that you can run without having to click into them and things like that. However, there is one use for notebooks, it seems, from what I've learned so far, which is when you develop a pipeline for some process, you know, so for example, using some of the scripts names on the left, if you need to do ingesting, splitting, and training, you can put all of those, link all of those scripts in a workflow on Databricks, which I'm only semi-familiar with, but I did see an example, so I'm pretty sure you can do it. And so so we can create a workflow, and then in the notebook, you can import a workflow and actually run every step of the workflow through the notebook. So that's one use that notebooks are good for, and I'm going to talk more about that process, which I think we're going to do in a little bit. But I just want to mention it first. Last thing I'll mention for now is they talk a lot about how, again, you have to use scripts for a service, you know, an MLOps platform, however you want to call it. And they talk about how you basically have to write those in IDEs, or, you know, you can do a text editor, but they mentioned a lot that people write those in IDEs. And I think they were saying you can do IDE integration with Databricks. It's not something I've tried yet. Maybe we'll do it. I'm not sure if we will, but I wanted to mention it. Something we could probably look into if you're interested. But I'm guessing for some people that'll be really potentially very relevant. So I just thought I'd note it here. All right, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the data side of our plan. I think this part is also relatively simple, should be pretty quick to discuss, since I think we're for now only going to work with, well, at least to get started, we're only working with a single CSV file that comes from the data source we were given before. So it's pretty easy I've already included it in Databricks. I uploaded it directly to their file system, and it was pretty straightforward, not that complicated. The only thing that we haven't done really is some of the some slight cleaning, manipulation to process the data, get it ready, and then as well as splitting the data into groups, do like train test, which we might need to do as well. I think it'll be helpful to have some set of testing data. So we might need to do that. Other than that, pretty straightforward. I think it's pretty much can be anything we need to do other than now that the data is uploaded. The only thing we might need to do is create like an ingestion file, which should be part of a pipeline anyway. Pipeline we would have created so one of the things heavily influencing how we will have to do this is that if we're going to be able to deploy this machine learning service, it will have to be able to take in new data, which obviously it's going to have the same feature columns, but it should be able to process the data the same way. So that means that included in any like testing pipeline will have to be the transformation and ingestion pipeline as well. So that'd be one key thing we need to do is make sure that we have a script for processing incoming data, which we can use for transforming the data we have now, as well as potential future data for testing. So that's one of the heavy influences, but that's not that complicated. It should just be one script, pretty straightforward. And I don't think we're going to need to use it, but one thing we could use is they have a Delta Lives tables feature in Databricks, which is very similar to like a pipeline or a workflow for processing the data. I don't really know all the details about what they can do there. They have like these standard tiers of data quality, but I don't think that's really relevant to what we're doing right now, so I wasn't planning on worrying about that for the time being. The only other additional thing that that we might need to consider, but I don't have the answer to this now, is depending on, we may have to go back and change how we work with this data, or how it's processed, maybe depending on how we deploy it. So at the moment, like obviously we're working from a CSV file that we've converted into a table. If for some reason we find that working with that data, we may have to change how it's formatted now in Databricks so that it matches like how a user would provide data. We may have to make some changes to our ingestion pipeline, but otherwise it should be pretty straightforward. We create a single pipeline, set up our data to work with that pipeline, and then modify it only if the deployment of the service we're creating doesn't match up with what we have now. But all that to say, this should really be done in basically one script that's managed from a Databricks workflow or job, which I'll talk about more in a minute. All right, next up, time to talk about what we're going to do with the machine learning models throughout this process. So we can basically manage everything throughout each step that we're going to go through, that being development, production, or staging and production. We can pretty much use MLflow to keep track of anything model related, since it saves information and saves models, so we can all keep track of all that stuff through MLflow. And additionally, it can be used, you can take models directly out of MLflow and then deploy them as well, which again, I'm going to cover all the more important stuff about how all of this happens in a second. So I'm just going to briefly mention that, as we develop and deploy, all of that can be done through MLflow. And I'm pretty sure most of that can all be managed through there, and that's what we're planning to do. All the details still need to be worked out. We're not going to go through every command we need or anything like that, but that's what our goal is to work through MLflow for managing all the model stuff, including experimenting and deploying, and I'll get into some of the details there in a minute. All right, so now it's time to talk about the most important stuff, which is how all the stuff I've described so far is actually going to run and can be, all the parts are going to be turned into a service, and how all the operations are going to be set up around it. I want to preface everything I'm about to say by saying that this is probably the part I'm least familiar with. Most of this stuff is new to me, I think for all of us as well. And so this is more so of a proposal. There's a good chance that as I describe what we're planning, there's things I'm missing, but I would hope that this is a good start, and you can give us feedback and suggest maybe improvements or things we might be missing, basically. Anyway, so let me get into what this diagram is showing. So I've talked about each of the individual parts, the models, code, and data, but this is how all of it's going to integrate a little bit. So during development, which shouldn't take too long, but anyway, during development, we can write the code in GitHub, or you can work on it on a local machine, and then integrate it via repositories. Either one's fine. But we'll each work on our, as we develop, we'll make our own branches, write the code, things like that. And if we need to do, I'm sure we'll need to do some testing of like the machine learning scripts. So, like training, testing, those kinds of scripts to make sure they work. And to do that, we can do that in notebooks while we're developing and save data as we go in experiments. Just thought I'd mention it. May not be that important for the overall service we're planning to provide, though. All right, so now the more important stuff. So as we develop, once we finish developing and we want to actually create our first usable service, right? Or like, so once we think we have a functioning service, we want to convert it into a staging setup where we can start to try to use it, right? And so I think we talked about that last Friday as well. And so that's kind of where the most of the configuration stuff we need to do is going to happen, at least from my experience. All right, so first things first, whatever Git provider we use, we're going to need to create a pull request. At least that's how I was planning to do it. So as we develop, we're developing the code, and then when it's time to put it into a staging version, we make a pull request, and that pull request in GitHub can trigger some unit testing automatically. And for unit testing, there may not be that much for what we're working on for now, but that one can be done through GitHub Actions, and to do that, you can use a YAML file. So what happens with the YAML file is you basically can set up a virtual, I think it's more of a container. Set up a container on GitHub. You could also do it off GitHub, but it's probably easier just for now to allow it to happen there. It sets up a container to run some tests, and you can use like PyTest, for example, in the YAML file to configure a test that you can use PyTest in a Python script to set up a test, and then use PyTest in the YAML file in the container to run those tests, right? So let me go through an example. So for example, I was looking at a template that sets up a PyTest test in a testing file to see if the transform process works. So if some data can actually be properly converted from like strings, for example, into a usable format for a machine learning model, right? So you may write a test that tries to access the transform script that would transform your data and make sure that transformation actually works correctly. So that might be a unit test we could set up. Since it doesn't require any machine learning training, it's easy to do on Git, as long as you have a test file for that purpose. So that's one thing we would do. That's an example of unit testing. After the unit test is when we start to consider trying to train a model that can actually demonstrate the machine learning functionality we're hoping to have. So now we go into not just unit testing, but actually integration testing. And for that, we can similarly have that triggered from GitHub. I believe I can or any Git provider, I believe. Same thing with Azure DevOps, or I think part of our group was working with AWS Code Commit. So I think you can do the same thing on both of those. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is from the Git provider, after the unit testing, you can trigger integration testing, which I believe the best way to do this is to have the Git provider interact back with Databricks, right? Because Databricks is you have all the models saved through MLflow on that platform, and so I think the best thing to do is have your Git provider trigger something that runs actually in Databricks. So and rather than trying to train a machine learning model in the Git provider, I'm not sure if it might be possible, but I don't think that's the best way to do it when you're working when you already have the model in Databricks. So you can I believe one way you can do this is you can have your Git provider trigger a workflow in Databricks that does training. So it processes data, trains a model, and then evaluates the model, all from a single workflow. And I think you can do this with a notebook. And so in that case, what would happen is the Git provider would send a request to Databricks through the Jobs API and ask the Jobs API to run a job that is identified in a notebook, and that notebook will run each of its stages. So you would have had to create a notebook that defines, here's my training procedure, and I think you can do this by referencing the scripts that you write. So the training procedure references the scripts you've written and will trigger the training process, or the transformation process, the training process, and evaluation process. And so that should be a way of doing an integration test to actually make sure that the scripts you've written can properly train a machine learning model and create something that works. Right. So I believe the other thing you can do is, I'm speculating on this part a little bit, but the other thing I believe you can do is have the same kind of configuration run tests. Actually, so yes, I believe in the same process where you're, transforming, training, all that stuff, when you evaluate, you can save the evaluation metrics and actually access those to determine, if you're meeting some kind of requirements potentially. That seems like a useful feature to be able to tell how good the model trained is, how good the service will be before you actually deploy it anywhere. And I believe you can do that through the same process, through a notebook, or so even if, I believe the notebook will work, but if you can't do it through a notebook, I believe the Jobs API also allows you to configure separate scripts to run, and you can indicate where your data is in Databricks. And so all this stuff should be definitely doable from a Git provider through requests to Databricks to run certain things. Okay, so next, we're going to want to, this financial fraud service, we presume we want to also be able to interact with it and be able, offer like a user testing situation. So after we've done these automated testing, all these automated tests, our plan after that is to allow the code to merge into a staging branch, and at that point, set up a deployment of what we've made so that someone can actually interact with it. This part is, I would say, something that I'm the least familiar with. I think other members of the team have been working on this more, but I'm going to do my best to describe how we might do it. So one option, probably the simplest option, is I believe now, maybe recently, Databricks offers a serverless deployment service. That might need, I saw somewhere that you might need to request special permission to do that, so maybe that's not really feasible for us. But it does appear to be something that's an option now, maybe for a production level service. Alternatively, we should be able to deploy directly the code we have at this staging point to AWS or Azure serverless compute services. So for example, in AWS, that's AWS Lambda. And I believe at this point, once we have the code in the staging branch, we can deploy it, send it off to AWS Lambda, and configure some way that we can access the service and see if it works, basically. And so that's our plan there. At that point, we would all interact with it, see if it works, how we would expect, but also we would plan to give you an opportunity to see what we've made and see if it works the way you'd expect, and maybe we have to go back and change some things at that point. Once we have something that works, I believe for now our plan is just to release that anything we've, the service we've deployed so far. Our plan would be to release similarly the same, so whatever we've created for, like a user test for you guys to for us to experiment with, for you guys to experiment with, we would also deploy the same way for the release phase. But the only additional thing would be, which we haven't really looked into that much as far as I know, but we would want to figure out how to monitor what we've done, and potentially set up some features that would allow us to maybe retrain. So go back to the staging phase, retrain something, and then deploy it again and see if it's better. So basically, what I'm thinking there, that might not have been a great explanation, but Databricks has tutorials, recommendations, or demos that suggest that sometimes it's useful to maybe retrain a model every week without actually changing the code, especially for a model like ours that's pretty low computation cost, since we're only working with like a small decision tree basically. And so they say, there is an opportunity, which unfortunately couldn't really tell you what the details of this would be, but it's definitely possible where every period at some point you trigger some retraining of a model from the staging phase and determine if the output model is better than the one that's currently in deployment, and maybe swap them out. This stuff I haven't really tried yet, and not quite sure how to do it, but I'm quite confident it's doable, mostly through MLflow. I think just by maybe changing, since there's a model registry, and just by changing which model in the registry is being deployed. I don't have the details for that, but I'm guessing that you just have to change switch an ID somewhere to reconfigure for deployment. And so again, the deployment, not my strong suit yet. I got to learn some more there, but I'm sure however we deploy, we can make it automated to change if necessary. Since all these other things we can change, and Databricks offers a lot of convenient APIs, I'm sure that we can find a way to set up that a monitoring and redeployment service if necessary. So that's primarily it for what I'm going to describe today. These are just some references that we used. Obviously, we don't need a lot of the things they talk about in these, since ours is pretty small scale for now. But I had some final notes I wanted to mention. So as I just talked about, I didn't realize, but there's actually like an API for everything in Databricks. So I haven't explored it that much yet, but I believe we can do a lot of the work on Databricks, and then anytime you need to go outside of the platform to do something, you can always access stuff that was on the platform via their APIs. So I believe maybe we can set a goal to try to do as much as possible on that platform, and then allowing you to be kind of cloud agnostic, and then demonstrate how, when necessary, we can use APIs on Databricks to access stuff that we've done there. The other thing was, so one of the references I was using to come up with this plan, they actually deprecated the template like 2 days ago. They have a whole video using a template that shows how to do MLOps, or a very simple version of it, or parts of it at least. And that notebook got deprecated 2 days ago, so there might be some changes to what I was doing, but I think I looked at it quickly, and it's generally set up the same way, so we should be okay. Those are just some final notes, but that is an outline of the things we hope to set up in the coming sprints, and ideally we can really get a actual service deployed, so we get some way more experience with that stage of things rather than some of the just having done DevOps and learning some basics of the Databricks platform so far. So hopefully that is kind of what you're looking for, and we can work from there to make some changes and come up with a really good plan for you.